Some debts can never be repaid, some wounds never heal, and some land, once it's in your blood, becomes more than property. It becomes your soul. The Montana sky was merciless that morning, vast and empty as a broken promise, when the foreclosure notice arrived. 30 days. 3 generations of sweat and sacrifice reduced to a banker's deadline. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the valley like vultures, patient and inevitable. They say you can measure a man by what he does when everything is falling apart, by the choices he makes when there's nothing left to lose, by who he helps when he himself is drowning. What happens when a stranger appears with secrets in her eyes and city dust on her boots? When the land you die to protect becomes the battleground for something larger than yourself. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as ruin. Sometimes the thing that breaks you is the only thing that can save you. And sometimes, the most dangerous truths are the ones we tell ourselves. Frank Mitchell stood motionless in his kitchen, the bank letter trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The bold red lettering seemed to pulsate. Final notice of foreclosure. 30 days to come up with $75,000, or the land that had been in his family for 3 generations would be gone. He placed the letter on the worn oak table, the same table where his grandfather had calculated crop yields, where his father had taught him to whittle, where he and Margaret had planned their future before cancer stole her away 5 years ago. Outside, the Montana sky darkened ominously. A storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. The Weather Service had issued warnings about a powerful system moving through Valley Creek, but Frank had more immediate concerns than rain. His 58-year-old body felt every one of those years as he sank into a kitchen chair. The familiar ache in his left knee, a souvenir from Desert Storm, flaring up as it always did when stress or bad weather approached. "Damn it all," he muttered, pushing himself back up. There was no time for self-pity. The irrigation system needed reinforcement before the storm hit, or he'd lose what little remained of his struggling alfalfa crop. As Frank stepped onto his porch, he breathed in the electric scent of approaching rain. Valley Creek stretched before him, a patchwork of farms nestled between rolling hills and the jagged peaks of distant mountains. This land had sustained his family since 1946, when his grandfather returned from World War II and purchased 200 acres of Montana promise with his combat pay. Now it might all slip through Frank's fingers, like the soil during drought season. His cell phone rang, his son Michael calling from Seattle, where he worked as a software engineer. Frank hesitated before answering. He hadn't told Michael about the foreclosure yet. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. You battening down for the storm?" "Working on it," Frank replied, his voice deliberately casual. "How's that fancy tech job treating you?" Good. Listen, I've been thinking about coming home for a few days next month. It's been a while." Frank swallowed hard. "That'd be nice, son. Real nice." After hanging up, Frank gazed at the darkening horizon. Would the Mitchell farm even exist when Michael planned to visit? The thought was almost too painful to bear. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall as Frank secured the last of the equipment in the barn. By the time he finished, the storm had escalated from concerning to dangerous. Wind howled through the valley, bending trees at alarming angles. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and in the distance, thunder rumbled like artillery fire. Frank was halfway to the house when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A car engine, revving desperately, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal striking rock. Peering through the downpour, he spotted headlights down by Crooked Creek, which normally was little more than a trickle, but now roared with floodwater. "Christ almighty," Frank muttered, already moving toward his truck. Some fool tourist had tried to cross the low-water bridge, not realizing that 10 minutes of Montana mountain rain could turn a peaceful creek into a raging torrent. The aging Ford pickup protested as Frank guided it down the muddy access road. Through the rain-smeared windshield, he could see an SUV with California plates, its front end already submerged in the rising water, tilted at a precarious angle against the concrete bridge support. A figure moved inside, illuminated by the vehicle's interior light. Frank parked on high ground and stepped into the storm, immediately drenched to the skin. The creek was rising visibly, already lapping at the SUV's door handles. 50 feet away, the old earthen dam that helped irrigate the eastern fields had begun to leak ominously. "Hey!" Frank shouted over the storm's fury. "Don't try to start it again. You'll flood the engine." The driver's window lowered slightly, and a woman's face appeared, pale with fear. "I can't open the door." The water pressure. Frank waded into the creek, cursing as the cold water filled his boots. The current pulled at his legs with surprising strength. If the dam gave way completely, both he and the stranded motorist would be swept downstream. "Roll down your window all the way," he shouted, bracing himself against the vehicle's frame. The woman complied, and Frank could see her more clearly now, middle-aged, with striking, silver-streaked auburn hair, framing a face that retained considerable beauty despite the fear distorting her features. "I'm going to have to pull you out through the window," Frank explained, the rain pelting his face. "The water's rising too fast. We don't have much time." "My bags," she began. "Leave them," Frank interrupted. "That dam upstream is about to go, and when it does, this whole area will be underwater." As if on cue, a deep, grinding sound echoed through the valley, the first section of the earthen dam giving way. Frank didn't hesitate. He reached through the window, grabbed the woman beneath her arms, and hauled her through the opening. She was lighter than he expected, but the awkward angle made the extraction difficult. Her shirt caught on something, tearing as she finally emerged. They had just made it to the pickup when the dam collapsed completely. A wall of water surged down the creek bed, lifting the SUV and slamming it against the bridge before sweeping it downstream like a child's toy. "My God," the woman whispered, watching her vehicle disappear into the churning darkness. "You're lucky to be alive," Frank said gruffly, turning the truck toward home. "What the hell were you thinking? Trying to cross during a flash flood warning?" "I didn't know," she replied, shivering despite the truck's heater blasting warm air. "I'm not from around here. I was following my GPS to a rental property, and it directed me across that bridge." Frank glanced at her. Up close, he could see a small cut on her forehead and the beginning of a bruise on her cheekbone where she must have struck the steering wheel. "You need to get that looked at," he said, nodding toward her injury. "It's nothing." She touched the cut gingerly. "I've had worse paper cuts. I'm Sophia, by the way. Sophia Reynolds." Frank Mitchell. He kept his eyes on the road, navigating the treacherous conditions. "The nearest hospital is in Riverside, 40 miles south, but that road will be flooded too by now. I've got a first aid kit at the house. We can at least clean that cut." Sophia nodded, clutching her purse, the only possession she'd managed to save. "Thank you. For everything. I can't believe I lost the car." "Insurance will cover it," Frank said matter-of-factly. "You're alive. That's what matters." The rain continued to hammer against the truck as they approached the Mitchell farmhouse. Built in 1952 by Frank's grandfather and father, the two-story structure had weathered countless Montana storms. Its white paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung at an angle that had been on Frank's fix-it list for longer than he cared to admit, but it stood solid against the elements. Inside, Frank switched on lights and gestured toward the kitchen. "Sit," he instructed, heading for the bathroom where he kept the first aid supplies. When he returned, Sophia was standing by the window, watching the storm rage. "I don't mean to be a burden," she said as he approached with the kit. "If there's a motel nearby, I can call a taxi once the weather clears." Frank snorted. "Nearest motel is in Riverside, same as the hospital. No taxis in Valley Creek, unless you count Billy Elkins, who might give you a ride in his '89 Buick if you catch him sober, which is rare these days." He opened the kit and removed an antiseptic wipe. "This'll sting." Sophia barely flinched as he cleaned the cut. Frank worked with the gentle efficiency of someone accustomed to treating injuries, a skill honed during his military service and refined through years of farm accidents. You mentioned a rental property, he asked, applying a small butterfly bandage to the cut. Yes, I leased a cabin for 3 months. I'm a writer, she explained. I needed somewhere quiet to finish my latest project. Frank raised an eyebrow. Don't know any rental cabins around here except the old Ross place up on Timber Ridge. But that hasn't been occupied in years. Sophia pulled a folded paper from her purse and handed it to him, a rental agreement with an address and crude map. That's it. The Ross cabin. The owner is someone named Victor Reynolds. I arranged everything online. Frank's expression darkened. Victor Reynolds doesn't own that property yet, though not for lack of trying. He returned the paper to her. The Ross family still technically owns it, but they moved to Florida after their logging business went under. Reynolds has been trying to buy up land all over the valley for some resort development scheme. Thunder cracked directly overhead, making the windows rattle. Frank stood and moved to the refrigerator. You hungry Storm's not letting up anytime soon, and you've had a shock. Food helps. Without waiting for an answer, he began pulling out ingredients for sandwiches. Sophia watched him work, taking in the kitchen with its 1970s appliances and handmade curtains that had clearly been hanging for decades. You've lived here a long time, she observed. All my life, except for my military service, Frank replied, slicing homemade bread. My grandfather bought this place after World War II. My father expanded it in the 60s. Now it's just me trying to hang on. He hadn't meant to add that last part, and he busied himself with the food to avoid her gaze. It's beautiful land, Sophia said softly. I can see why you'd want to preserve it. Frank placed a plate before her, a sandwich with thick sliced ham, cheese, lettuce, and tomato. Eat. I'm going to check on the livestock. The barn should hold, but this storm is fiercer than predicted. By the time Frank returned, soaked again despite his rain gear, Sophia had finished her sandwich and washed the plate. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the kitchen, clearly uncertain about her situation. Storm's not letting up before morning, Frank announced, removing his dripping coat. And most of the valley roads are flooded. You'll have to stay here tonight. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, it's practicality. Frank interrupted. I've got a guest room upstairs. My son's old room. Sheets are clean. Sophia looked like she wanted to argue, but instead nodded. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without your help tonight. Frank led her upstairs to Michael's room, which remained largely unchanged since his son had left for college 9 years earlier. Academic trophies lined a shelf, and a faded poster of the Seattle skyline hung on one wall, an early indication of where Michael would eventually settle. Bathrooms across the hall, Frank explained. I put out a clean towel and t-shirt. It'll be big on you, but at least it's dry. Sophia smiled gratefully. You've thought of everything. Farmers have to be prepared, Frank replied with a shrug. Never know what's coming next. He had no idea how true those words would prove to be. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Frank was already on his second cup of coffee when Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her clothes from the previous day, now mostly dried. Good morning, she said tentatively. I hope I didn't oversleep. It's barely 6, Frank replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. But damage assessment starts early after a storm like that. Sophia accepted the coffee gratefully. How bad is it? Could have been worse. Lost part of the eastern irrigation system when the dam went. Barn roof leaked in the same spot it always does. Few trees down. He sipped his coffee. Your car's probably halfway to Idaho by now. I've already called the rental company, Sophia said. They're arranging for a replacement, but it won't be delivered until tomorrow. I was hoping. She hesitated. Would it be possible for you to take me to the cabin today? I really need to get started on my work. Frank considered the request. He had plenty to do repairing storm damage, but he was also curious about the condition of the Ross cabin. No one had lived there for at least 5 years. I can take you up there, he agreed, but don't get your hopes up. That place wasn't in great shape before the storm. An hour later, They were bumping up the rutted access road to Timber Ridge in Frank's truck. The storm had left its mark everywhere down branches, new gullies carved by rainwater, a hawk's nest blown from a tall pine. As they rounded the final bend, the Ross cabin came into view, and Frank's prediction proved accurate. The small log structure had once been charming, with a covered porch facing the valley and large windows to capture the mountain light. Now, one of those windows was shattered. Part of the porch roof had collapsed, and a large pine branch had punched through the rear of the building. "Oh," Sophia said quietly, her disappointment evident. Frank parked and they approached the damaged cabin cautiously. The interior was damp, with rainwater pooled on the wooden floors. The branch had crashed through the bathroom, rupturing a pipe that had sprayed water until the pressure dropped. "This isn't habitable," Frank declared after a brief inspection. "Structural damage, broken plumbing, probably electrical issues too. You can't stay here." Sophia stood in the middle of the main room, surveying the damage with a composed expression that surprised Frank. He had expected tears or anger, not this thoughtful assessment. "How long would it take to repair?" she asked. Frank scratched his stubbled chin. "Couple weeks, minimum. That's if you can find someone to do it. Contractors around here are backed up for months, especially after a storm." "Could you do it?" Sophia asked directly. The question caught Frank off guard. "Me? You're clearly handy," she continued. "This place isn't that large. I'd pay you." "Of course." "Very well." Frank almost laughed. "Ma'am, I've got a farm to run, storm damage to repair on my own place." "I understand," Sophia replied, "but I really need this cabin. Mr. Mitchell, I came here specifically for the solitude and views. My work depends on it." She paused. "I'd pay $10,000 for the repairs, plus materials." Frank stared at her. $10,000 was a significant sum, enough to make the next mortgage payment with some left over for the irrigation repairs. But something didn't add up. "That's a lot of money for a few weeks' worth of repairs," he said slowly. "What kind of writing pays that well?" "I've had some success," Sophia replied vaguely. "Literary fiction, and this project is important to me." "Time sensitive, you might say." Frank studied her for a long moment. There was something she wasn't telling him, but the money was too good to pass up, especially with the foreclosure deadline looming. "I'd need half up front for materials," he said finally. "And I can only work on it part-time. My farm comes first." "Of course," Sophia agreed quickly. "When could you start?" And that was how Frank Mitchell, third-generation Montana farmer, found himself agreeing to repair a storm-damaged cabin for a mysterious writer from California who seemed far too willing to part with large sums of money. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Frank would work on his farm from dawn until early afternoon, then drive Sophia to the cabin where he'd spend a few hours on repairs before returning her to the farmhouse for dinner. Her replacement vehicle had arrived, another SUV, but this one with Montana rental plates giving her some independence. But she seemed content with their arrangement. Frank focused first on the structural damage, removing the fallen branch and patching the cabin roof. Sophia often sat on a boulder nearby, a notebook open on her lap, occasionally writing but more often just watching him work, asking questions about the valley, the changing light on the mountains, the history of the Ross family. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who's supposed to be writing," Frank observed on the third afternoon as he replaced rotted boards on the porch. Sophia smiled enigmatically. "All of it feeds the work, Mr. Mitchell. You've been sleeping under my roof for days now. Might as well call me Frank." "Frank," she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "And I'm Sophia, not ma'am or Miss Reynolds." He nodded, hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. There was something about this woman that unsettled him, not in an unpleasant way, but in a manner he hadn't experienced since meeting Margaret at a county fair 28 years earlier. At 58, Frank had assumed such feelings were behind him, especially after the hollowing grief of watching his wife wither away from cancer. They were replacing the broken window together when the first unwelcome visitors arrived. 3 men in a mud-splattered pickup truck pulled up to the cabin, their arrival announced by the crunch of gravel and the sudden silence of an engine cut mid-throttle. Frank straightened, instantly alert to the tension in the air. Valley Creek was generally peaceful, but he recognized trouble when he saw it. "Stay inside," he told Sophia quietly. "What is it?" she asked, peering past him. "Don't know yet," Frank replied, setting down his tools. "But those boys aren't here for conversation." The 3 men approached with the loose-limbed confidence of those looking for trouble. The leader, a lanky fellow with a patchy beard and camouflage jacket, carried a rifle slung casually over his shoulder, not unusual in Montana, but the way he gripped it suggested it wasn't just for hunting deer. "Afternoon," Frank called, positioning himself on the porch steps, deliberately casual but blocking access to the cabin. "Something I can help you with." "Didn't know anyone was staying up here," the leader replied, his eyes moving past Frank to glimpse Sophia in the doorway behind him. "Ross Place has been empty for years. It's being renovated," Frank said evenly. "Private property." The second man, shorter but powerfully built, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "This used to be good hunting ground before the no trespassing signs went up. Thought we might do some scouting." "Season doesn't open for 2 months," Frank pointed out, "and the signs are still up." The third man, who had remained silent, suddenly nudged the leader and muttered something. The leader's expression changed as he took a closer look at Frank. "Hey, you're Mitchell from down in the valley, ain't you? The one about to lose his farm to the bank?" Frank's jaw tightened. Word traveled fast in small communities, but he hadn't expected his financial troubles to be common knowledge yet. "My business is my business," he replied coldly. "And right now, my business is fixing this cabin. So unless you've got legitimate reason to be here, I suggest you move along." The leader took a step forward, hands shifting on his rifle. "Maybe we don't feel like moving along. Maybe we were hoping to find this place empty so we could borrow a few things. Empty cabins have all sorts of useful stuff." Frank's military training kicked in, his body automatically assessing threats and options. 3 men, at least 1 firearm, possibly more concealed. His own shotgun was in the truck, too far to reach. He was unarmed except for his carpenter's hammer, still in his belt. "That would be a mistake," Frank said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that few people had ever heard. "A serious one." Something in his tone made the leader hesitate. Frank Mitchell was no longer a young man, but at 6'1", with shoulders broadened by decades of farm work and the bearing of a man who had seen combat, he presented a formidable figure. The tense standoff might have escalated further, if not for the sudden appearance of Sophia on the porch beside Frank. She held her phone up, clearly recording. "I've already called the sheriff," she announced calmly. "And I have your faces and license plate on video. Is petty theft really worth going back to jail? It was a bluff cell service, was spotty at best on Timber Ridge, but delivered with such confidence that the 3 men exchanged uncertain glances." "We don't want any trouble," the leader said, already backing toward their truck. "Just a misunderstanding." "Then misunderstand your way off this property," Frank replied, not moving from his position. They retreated, the truck's engine roaring to life with unnecessary aggression. As they disappeared down the access road, Frank turned to Sophia with newfound respect. "Quick thinking with the phone," he acknowledged, "though the sheriff would need a carrier pigeon to get a message up here." Sophia slipped the phone back into her pocket, and Frank noticed her hand was trembling slightly despite her calm demeanor. "I'm familiar with men like that," she said. "All bluster until confronted. Then they fold." "Sometimes," Frank agreed. "Not always. Those weren't just ordinary troublemakers. The short one did time for armed robbery last year." Sophia's eyes widened. "You knew them?" "Of them," Frank clarified. "Valley Creek's not big. Word gets around." He paused. "They were right about one thing, though. I'm about to lose the farm to the bank." He hadn't meant to share that, but the confrontation had left him off balance. Sophia studied him for a long moment before responding. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked quietly. Frank shook his head. "Unless you've got $75,000 hidden in that notebook of yours." "Not really. It's just the way things go sometimes. Farming's a gamble, and I've had a long streak of losing hands." He turned back to the window installation, effectively ending the conversation, but he could feel Sophia's eyes on him, thoughtful and calculating in a way that made him wonder again exactly who she was and what had really brought her to Valley Creek. The next morning, Frank drove into town for supplies. Valley Creek was little more than a main street with essential businesses, a general store, a diner, a feed supply, a small bank branch, and a gas station. Everyone knew everyone, which meant that Frank couldn't avoid questions about the woman staying at his farm. "Heard you took in one of those California types during the storm," said Hank Peterson, owner of the hardware store, as he rang up Frank's purchases. "Mary Beth at the diner says she's some kind of writer. Just helping someone in need," Frank replied noncommittally. "She's renting the Ross cabin." Hank's bushy eyebrows shot up. "That old place, it was falling apart before the storm hit it." "I'm fixing it up," Frank said, counting out cash for the supplies. "Since when are you in the contracting business? Thought you had enough work keeping that farm running." Frank pocketed his change. "She's paying well. Times are tough." Understanding dawned on Hank's weathered face. Like everyone else in Valley Creek, he had probably heard about the foreclosure notice. "Ah, well, good for you." Then, as Frank loaded supplies into his truck, he noticed a sleek black Mercedes parked outside the bank, a vehicle that screamed, "Not from around here," even louder than Sophia's rental SUV. His curiosity was satisfied moments later when Victor Reynolds emerged from the bank, engaged in animated conversation with the branch manager. Reynolds was a study in calculated image expensive suit, tailored to hide his spreading middle. Salt and pepper hair styled to suggest vigor rather than age, a smile that never reached his eyes. He had appeared in Valley Creek 3 years earlier, presenting himself as a visionary developer who would transform the struggling agricultural community into a resort destination. Frank had disliked him on sight and rebuffed his initial offer to buy the Mitchell farm. Since then, Reynolds had acquired several properties in the valley, including the foreclosed Johnson Place and Old Man Wilkins' hunting acreage. Reynolds spotted Frank and altered his course, approaching with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Frank Mitchell," he called, extending his hand. "Just the man I wanted to see." Frank reluctantly shook the offered hand. "Reynolds, I understand you're doing some work on the Ross cabin," Reynolds said, getting straight to business. "Interesting, since I have a pending offer on that property." "Take it up with the Ross family," Frank replied. "I'm just doing repairs for a renter." Reynolds' smile tightened. "Ah, yes, the mysterious writer from California. Quite generous with her renovation budget. I hear." The implication that Reynolds had been asking around about Sophia set Frank's teeth on edge. "Don't you have some golf course to build?" "Valley Pines Resort will be much more than a golf course." "Frank," Reynolds replied smoothly, "it's going to revitalize this entire community. 200 jobs, tourism dollars, infrastructure improvements, and all it costs is the soul of the valley," Frank countered. "Turning family farms into vacation condos for rich folks who'll visit twice a year." Reynolds sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Progress is inevitable. Frank, the small family farm is dying all across America. You can either profit from the change or be crushed by it." He paused. "Speaking of which, I heard about your situation with the bank. 30 days isn't much time to come up with $75,000. The casual mention of his private financial troubles felt like a violation. "Been busy, haven't you?" "I make it my business to stay informed," Reynolds replied. "My offer still stands $850,000 for the Mitchell property. More than fair in today's market, especially considering your circumstances." The offer was indeed generous enough to pay off the bank and leave Frank with a comfortable nest egg. But accepting would mean the end of his family's legacy and a victory for everything he despised about Reynolds' vision for Valley Creek. Not interested, Frank said flatly. Reynolds shook his head with exaggerated regret. Pride is expensive. Frank, when the bank forecloses, you'll get much less at auction, and I'll likely buy it anyway. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. When you reconsider, call me. The offer expires when your time with the bank does. Frank left the card on the ground where it fell and climbed into his truck. As he drove back toward the farm, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. Reynolds' interest in his conversation with Sophia troubled him deeply, suggesting that the developer had resources and connections beyond what he had previously demonstrated. When Frank arrived at the cabin later that afternoon, he found Sophia sitting on the newly repaired porch, a sketch pad open on her lap. This was new. He had only seen her with her writing notebook before. Branching out from writing, he asked, unloading supplies from the truck. Sophia quickly closed the pad. Just doodling. Helps me think. She stood and approached the truck. Need help carrying anything? Frank handed her a bag of lighter items and took the lumber himself. Met your landlord in town today, he said casually, watching for her reaction. Victor Reynolds seems very interested in you. Sophia's step faltered momentarily. Oh, what did he say? That he has a pending offer on this property, which makes me wonder how he's renting it to you. She set the bag down inside the cabin door. The Ross family granted him authority to manage the property while the sale is being negotiated. Perfectly legitimate. And your connection to Reynolds, Sophia met his gaze directly. I found the rental listing online. There's no connection beyond that of tenant and property manager. She paused. Why the interrogation? Frank. He busied himself organizing tools. Reynolds isn't well liked around here. He's buying up land to build a resort that would change the character of the entire valley. Those of us with deep roots find that troubling. And you think I'm part of his plan somehow? Sophia sounded genuinely surprised. I assure you, I'm just a writer looking for a quiet place to work. Speaking of which, how much longer until the cabin is habitable? The basic repairs, at least. The change of subject was obvious, but Frank allowed it. Plumbing's fixed, roof doesn't leak, windows in. Still need to repair the porch roof and assess the electrical system. But you could probably move in tomorrow if you're not too particular about comfort. Tomorrow would be perfect, Sophia said, relief evident in her voice. You've been very kind, Frank, but I really do need my own space to work effectively. Frank nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of disappointment at the prospect of her leaving his farmhouse. He had grown accustomed to their evening conversations over dinner, to the sound of another person moving about the old house. It had been a long time since he had shared his space or his thoughts with anyone. As he worked on the porch roof, Frank found his eyes drawn repeatedly to Sophia, who had reopened her sketch pad and was working with focused intensity. From his elevated position, he could occasionally glimpse what she was drawing, not idle doodles as she had claimed, but a detailed landscape study of the valley vista. The skill evident in her work surpassed mere hobby level, suggesting formal training. Another piece of the puzzle that was Sophia Reynolds, Frank thought. A writer who drew like an artist, who handled confrontation with unusual composure, who carried herself with an unplaceable elegance that seemed at odds with her claimed profession. The incongruities bothered him, not because he suspected her of malicious intent, but because he found himself increasingly drawn to her, and distrust was a poor foundation for any relationship. The afternoon was fading into early evening when they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Frank tensed, remembering their previous visitors, but the engine's purr was too refined to be the poacher's truck. Expecting someone, he asked Sophia, who shook her head, looking equally concerned. The black Mercedes that appeared around the bend confirmed Frank's suspicions. Victor Reynolds had decided to pay a visit to his tenant. Frank descended from the roof as the developer parked and emerged from his vehicle. today dressed in what presumably passed for casual attire among his set-pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Frank's monthly grocery budget. "Mr. Reynolds," Sophia greeted him, closing her sketch pad and setting it aside. "This is a surprise. Ms. Reynolds," Victor replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was in the area and thought I'd check on the cabin repairs. I understand there was significant storm damage." His gaze shifted to Frank, acknowledging him with a nod. "Mitchell, I see you've been busy." "Just about finished," Frank replied curtly. "Excellent. I appreciate you stepping in on such short notice." Reynolds turned back to Sophia. "I hope the accommodations meet your expectations. Ms. Reynolds, when you made the booking, I wasn't aware of your status." Something unspoken passed between them, a current of tension that Frank couldn't decipher. Sophia's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "The cabin is exactly what I needed," she replied. "Secluded, authentic, with magnificent views. Mr. Mitchell has done wonders restoring it after the storm." Reynolds' smile tightened. "Yes, he's quite the handyman. Among his many talents," he gestured toward the sketch pad. "I didn't realize you were an artist as well as a writer." "Just a hobby," Sophia said dismissively. "It helps me visualize scenes for my writing." "Of course," Reynolds checked his watch. "Well, I won't intrude on your creative process any longer. I merely wanted to ensure that everything was satisfactory." He produced a business card and handed it to Sophia. "Please call if you need anything at all during your stay." Anything. The emphasis made Frank's jaw tighten, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. There was something proprietary in Reynolds' manner, as if he considered Sophia an asset rather than a tenant. After Reynolds departed, an uncomfortable silence fell between Frank and Sophia. She stood at the edge of the porch, watching the dust settle on the access road, her expression troubled. "He seems very attentive for a property manager," Frank observed. Sophia turned to him with a forced smile. "Small-town hospitality, I suppose." "Reynolds wouldn't know hospitality if it bit him on the ass," Frank replied bluntly. "He wants something, perhaps just to ensure his tenant is happy." Frank snorted. "Reynolds doesn't care about making people happy unless there's profit in it. Whatever he's after, be careful." He hesitated, then added, "I've nearly finished here. You can move in tomorrow as planned, but I'll sleep in my truck outside tonight." "That's not necessary. Those poachers might come back," Frank interrupted. "And something tells me Reynolds' visit might have been partly to assess the cabin's defenses. I don't trust him." Sophia studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Frank Mitchell. They don't make many like you anymore." The simple compliment affected him more than it should have, warming places in his heart that had been cold for years. "Let me get the electrical checked," he said gruffly, turning away to hide his reaction. "Then I'll drive you back to the farm to pack your things." That night, Frank lay awake in the cab of his truck, parked where he could see both the cabin's front door and the access road. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the Montana sky, the air carrying the sweet scent of pine mixed with the earthy aroma of soil still damp from the recent storm. Inside the cabin, a single light burned in what had once been the Ross family's living room. Frank imagined Sophia at the rough wooden table, working on her mysterious writing project, or perhaps sketching another valley scene. The thought of her nearby, separated only by logs and glass, provoked feelings he hadn't experienced in years, a mixture of protectiveness and longing that both comforted and disturbed him. Frank was drifting towards sleep when a noise snapped him fully alert, the distinctive sound of a branch breaking underfoot. Someone was approaching the cabin on foot, moving with deliberate stealth. Silently, Frank reached for the shotgun he'd placed on the passenger seat. Years of military training reasserted themselves as he eased from the truck, staying low and using the vehicle for cover. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows, and Frank waited, watching for movement. There a figure moving between trees at the edge of the clearing, then another, approaching from a different angle. Frank counted 3 distinct shapes, recognizing the coordinated approach of men with a plan. The poachers had returned. Likely emboldened by alcohol and resentment, Frank considered his options. He could confront them directly, using the shotgun as a deterrent. He could attempt to reach the cabin and barricade himself and Sophia inside, or he could try to scare them off without revealing his position. The decision was made for him when one of the figures produced what looked like a Molotov cocktail, a bottle with a rag stuffed in its neck. The man struck a lighter, and the rag burst into flame. Frank raised the shotgun and fired into the air. The blast shattered the night's silence, echoing off the surrounding hills. "Next one won't be a warning," he shouted. The figures scattered, but the man with the Molotov hurled it toward the cabin before fleeing. The flaming bottle arced through the air, but fell short of its target, exploding against a rock and igniting the dry undergrowth. "Fire!" Frank yelled, already running toward the flames. "Sophia, get out!" The cabin door flew open, and Sophia emerged, clutching her notebook and sketchpad. "What's happening?" "Poachers with a firebomb," Frank explained tersely, grabbing a shovel from his truck. "Help me before it spreads hard together." They fought the growing fire, Frank digging fire breaks while Sophia used a bucket to ferry water from the cabin's newly repaired plumbing. The flames were persistent, fed by dry pine needles and underbrush, but finally yielded to their efforts. As they stood panting amidst the smoldering remains of what could have been a devastating forest fire, Frank surveyed the darkness, shotgun ready. "I think they're gone, but they might come back with reinforcements." Sophia's face was smudged with soot, her clothes disheveled, but her eyes were clear and determined. "We should call the sheriff," Frank nodded. "First light. We'll drive into cell range and make the call. For now, we both sleep in the cabin. I'll take the first watch." Inside, they arranged a makeshift alarm system using fishing line and cans from the supplies Frank had brought. It wasn't sophisticated, but anyone approaching the cabin would trigger enough noise to wake them. "Why would they do this?" Sophia asked as they finished the preparations. "What could they possibly gain from burning down an empty cabin?" Frank checked the shotgun's load before setting it near the door. "Could be several things. Revenge for being confronted earlier, bored, drunk idiots looking for excitement, or," he hesitated, "or what? Or someone paid them to create problems." Frank finished. "Reynolds wants this property badly. The Ross family has been holding out for more money, but if the cabin burned down, the land value would drop." Sophia sank onto a chair, absorbing the implications. "You think Victor Reynolds would go that far? Arson is a serious crime." "Men like Reynolds don't get their hands dirty," Frank replied. "They find desperate people to do the dirty work, maintaining plausible deniability." He didn't add his other suspicion that Reynolds might have a particular interest in driving away this specific tenant. The developer's unusual attention to Sophia suggested motives beyond simple property acquisition. "You should try to get some sleep," Frank said, pulling a chair to the window where he could watch the approach to the cabin. "I'll wake you in a few hours to trade places." Sophia hesitated, then impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank. Not just for the repairs, but for everything." The simple touch sent warmth through Frank's body, unexpected and powerful. "Just doing what anyone would do," he muttered, embarrassed by his reaction. "No," Sophia said softly. "What you're doing is extraordinary. More than I had any right to expect from a stranger." She withdrew her hand and moved to the small bedroom, pausing at the door. "Good night, Frank." "Good night," he replied, settling in for his vigil, acutely aware that Sophia Reynolds had somehow, in just a few days, become far more than a stranger to him. The next morning, they reported the incident to Sheriff Dave Larson, a childhood friend of Frank's who took the attempted arson seriously but seemed skeptical about any connection to Victor Reynolds. "Those three idiots have been causing trouble since high school," Larson said, making notes in his official booklet. "But accusing Reynolds of hiring them for arson? That's a serious claim without evidence." "Frank, I'm not officially accusing anyone," Frank clarified. just noting that Reynolds has been pushing hard to acquire that property, and suddenly there's an attempt to burn it down. Seems worth looking into. Larson sighed. I'll talk to them, but don't expect much. And Frank, he glanced at Sophia, who was giving her statement to a deputy nearby. Be careful with this situation. Reynolds has a lot of influence with the county commissioners these days. He's promising jobs and tax revenue that this area desperately needs. At what cost? Dave turning Valley Creek into a playground for rich tourists while destroying everything that makes it special? The sheriff shook his head. Not my department, Frank. I just enforce the laws, not make economic policy. He closed his notebook. I'll have patrols check the cabin area more frequently for the next few weeks. Best I can do. As they drove back to the cabin, Frank brooded over the conversation. The sheriff's reluctance to confront Reynolds directly confirmed what he had suspected: the developer's influence was growing. His promises of economic revitalization swaying local officials who saw only dollar signs instead of the true cost to the valley's character and heritage. You're very quiet, Sophia observed, breaking the silence. Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter. Just thinking about how things change. Valley Creek used to be a place where everyone looked out for each other. Now it's every man for himself, scrambling for whatever crumbs Reynolds and his kind deign to throw our way. Is it really that simple? Sophia asked. I can understand wanting to preserve tradition and heritage, but if young people are leaving because there are no opportunities, if families can't make ends meet. You sound like Reynolds, Frank snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. Sorry, it's a sore spot. My son left for the same reasons: no future here. He said, and he wasn't wrong, but there are ways to create opportunity without destroying what makes a place special. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Like what? Sustainable tourism that celebrates the valley's agricultural heritage instead of paving over it. Processing facilities for value-added products from local farms. Artists' retreats that utilize existing structures. Frank surprised himself with the ideas that had apparently been percolating in his subconscious. The problem with Reynolds' vision is that it erases what's already here instead of building on it. That's quite insightful, Sophia said, studying him with newfound interest. Have you shared these ideas with others in the community? Frank shrugged. What's the point? I can barely save my own farm, let alone reshape the valley's economic future. They had reached the cabin, which looked peaceful in the morning light, showing no signs of the previous night's drama, except for the blackened patch of ground where the fire had been contained. I should finish moving in, Sophia said as they parked. Make this place properly habitable. Frank nodded, suddenly aware that their unusual arrangement was shifting. With the cabin repairs essentially complete, his legitimate reasons for being there were dwindling. I'll check the electrical one more time. Make sure everything's safe, he offered, not quite ready to leave. As he worked, testing outlets and examining the ancient fuse box, Frank found himself watching Sophia from the corner of his eye. She moved with purpose, arranging her sparse belongings, the notebook and sketch pad, a small collection of books, a laptop computer that she set up on the rustic table. There was something deliberate in her placement of each item, as if creating a specific environment rather than simply unpacking. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had been transformed from an empty shell to a functional, if Spartan, living space. Frank had run out of reasons to stay, yet found himself lingering, inventing small tasks that needed attention. I think that's everything, he finally admitted, replacing a screwdriver in his toolbox. It's perfect, Sophia declared, surveying the space with evident satisfaction. Exactly what I needed. She turned to him, her expression softening. I can't thank you enough. Frank, you've gone above and beyond what anyone could have expected. Just doing the job, he replied awkwardly, unused to praise. No, Sophia insisted. You did much more than repair a cabin. You rescued me from a flood, opened your home to a stranger, protected me from those men. You've been a guardian angel. Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks. Hardly an angel, Just a farmer with some skills and too much time on his hands. And modest, too, Sophia said with a smile that reached her eyes. Will you stay for dinner? It's the least I can do. I'm not much of a cook, but I make a passable pasta dish. The invitation caught Frank off guard. He had assumed their unusual association would end with the completion of the repairs, that Sophia would retreat into her writing, and he would return to the grim reality of his farm's impending foreclosure. I'd like that, he heard himself say. Let me just call and check on the livestock first. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Frank found himself sitting across from Sophia at the small wooden table, sharing a meal that was indeed more than passable. She had somehow transformed simple ingredients into a flavorful pasta with herbs and garlic, accompanied by a bottle of wine that she had produced from her limited luggage. To new friendships, Sophia proposed, raising her glass. New friendships, Frank echoed, the wine warming him in a way that had little to do with its alcohol content. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on books they had read, places they had visited, the changing seasons in Montana versus California. Frank found himself sharing stories he hadn't recalled in years, his father teaching him to fish in the creek that ran through their property, his mother's legendary apple pies that won ribbons at the county fair, the first calf he had delivered alone at age 12. In turn, Sophia spoke of growing up in San Francisco, her early love of art and literature, travels through Europe in her 20s. But Frank noticed she rarely mentioned her current life or specific details about her writing career. When he asked about her family, she deftly changed the subject. Do you miss it? Frank asked as they moved to the porch after dinner. The valley spread before them like a painting, twilight softening its contours. The city, all this isolation must be quite a change. Sophia gazed at the darkening landscape. I miss certain conveniences, certain people, but there's a clarity here that I've been searching for. In the city, everything is noise, literal and figurative. Here, I can hear myself think, see things as they truly are. She turned to him, her expression serious in the fading light. What about you? Frank, if you lose the farm, what will you do? Where will you go? The question cut to the heart of the fear he had been avoiding. I don't know, he admitted. Farming is all I've ever known, all I've ever wanted to do. Michael, my son, has offered me a place in Seattle, but I can't imagine living in a city, trapped in an apartment like a caged animal. There are other farms, other places, Sophia suggested gently. Frank shook his head. Not for me. Every inch of that land has Mitchell blood and sweat in it. My grandfather's fingerprints are on the barn beams. My father's footprints are in the concrete of the milking parlor floor. Margaret's rose bushes still bloom by the kitchen door. His voice roughened. If I lose it, I lose them too. In a way. Sophia was silent for a long moment. I understand attachment to place, she said finally. The way it becomes part of your identity, shapes who you are. She hesitated. But sometimes losing one thing opens the door to discovering another. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. Frank wanted to dismiss the platitude, but there was something in her tone that suggested personal experience, hard-won wisdom rather than empty consolation. Maybe, he conceded, but this particular ending feels pretty damn final. The conversation might have continued further if not for the distant sound of an approaching vehicle. Frank tensed, remembering the previous night's visitors, but the headlights that appeared around the bend belonged to a familiar county sheriff's patrol car. Dave Larson stepped out, his expression grim as he approached the porch. Frank, Ms. Reynolds, sorry to disturb your evening. What is it, Dave? Frank asked, recognizing the particular set of his friend's shoulders that signaled bad news. We caught 2 of the 3 men from last night, Larson reported. They were drunk again, bragging about the prank at the old Ross place. He paused. They admitted to the attempted arson but claimed they were paid to do it. Frank's eyes narrowed. By Reynolds. Larson shook his head. That's just it. They say they were hired by someone claiming to represent Ms. Reynolds here. He turned to Sophia. They described a man who showed them a photograph of you, said you were an art thief who had stolen valuable paintings, told them scaring you off would be a public service. Frank stared at Sophia, whose face had gone pale. Art thief, that's ridiculous. Of course it is, Larson agreed. But it raises some questions. Why would someone want to frighten Ms. Reynolds away from Valley Creek? And why use that particular story? Sophia had regained her composure, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her wineglass. I have no idea. Perhaps it was simply a convenient lie to motivate them. Larson studied her with the neutral expression he had perfected over 2 decades in law enforcement. Perhaps, but it's an oddly specific lie. Don't you think, especially since a quick internet search of your name doesn't turn up any published books, despite your claim to be a successful writer? The implication hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Frank looked at Sophia, suddenly uncertain about everything he thought he knew about her. I write under a pseudonym, Sophia said smoothly. Many authors do, for privacy. And what would that pseudonym be? Larson asked. I'm not obligated to share that information, Sophia replied, her tone cooling. Is there an actual accusation here? Sheriff, am I suspected of a crime? Larson shook his head. No, ma'am. Just trying to understand the situation. Someone went to considerable trouble to frighten you, possibly harm you. That concerns me. It concerns me as well, Sophia acknowledged. But I assure you, I am not an art thief. I'm simply a writer seeking solitude to complete an important project. The sheriff nodded, clearly unsatisfied but recognizing the limits of his authority. All right, I've increased patrols in this area, as promised. If you see or hear anything suspicious, call immediately. He handed her a card with his direct number. Cell service is spotty up here, but there's a landline in the cabin that should work in an emergency. After Larson departed, an uncomfortable silence fell between Frank and Sophia. The easy camaraderie of their dinner had evaporated, replaced by the weight of unasked questions. I should go, Frank said finally, gathering his tools. It's getting late, and I have an early start tomorrow. Sophia stood, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. Of course. Thank you again for everything. Frank. He paused at the steps, torn between the desire to simply leave and the need to address what had just happened. Sophia, he began, uncertain how to proceed. I don't know what's going on here, but I think you owe me some truth. Who are you, really? And why would someone go to such lengths to drive you away? She met his gaze steadily. I've told you who I am. As for why someone would want me gone, she hesitated. I can only assume it's related to this property somehow. Perhaps Reynolds has plans he doesn't want witnessed or documented. It was a plausible explanation, but Frank sensed there was more she wasn't saying. Still, he had no right to demand her secrets, especially when he had his own reasons for keeping certain truths private. Just be careful, he advised. Whatever's happening here, it's escalating. Keep the doors locked, and call me if anything seems off, day or night. Sophia nodded, her expression softening. I will. And Frank, I meant what I said earlier. You've been a guardian angel when I needed one most. I won't forget that. As Frank drove back to his farm, the evening's events replayed in his mind. Sheriff Larson's revelation about the art thief accusation was bizarre, yet somehow not entirely surprising. From the moment he had pulled Sophia from her flooding car, Frank had sensed there was more to her than met the eye. The question was whether that more represented a danger to him or to Valley Creek, and whether his growing feelings for this mysterious woman were blinding him to potential threats. By the time he reached the farmhouse, stars were scattered across the Montana sky like spilled diamonds. Frank stepped onto his porch and looked out over the land that had been his family's for generations. Land that would soon be lost unless a miracle occurred. What would you do, Dad? He murmured to the night air. What's the right path here? Only the crickets answered, their chorus a reminder that nature continued its cycles regardless of human troubles. Frank sighed and entered the empty house, suddenly aware of how thoroughly Sophia's brief presence had dispelled the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Whatever secret she was keeping, whatever her true purpose in Valley Creek, Frank Mitchell was beginning to realize that Sophia Reynolds had awakened something in him that he had thought died with Margaret hope for a future that might contain more than solitary perseverance against mounting odds. The question was whether that hope was founded in reality or merely another path to disappointment and loss. The autumn light falls differently across Valley Creek now, golden and forgiving. It traces the contours of land that has witnessed both desperation and redemption. A farmer's calloused hands, once clenched in defiance against inevitable loss, now rest easily on a fence post that marks not an ending, but a continuation. We search for worth in what we own, in acres measured and deeds recorded. But true value lies in what cannot be bought or sold, courage shown when fear would be easier, truth offered when lies would be simpler, and hands extended when all else is falling away. Frank Mitchell saved a stranger from floodwaters, never knowing she would become the current that changed his own course. Sophia Reynolds sought solitude to complete one final masterpiece, finding instead that her greatest work would be painted not on canvas, but in the restoration of a man's broken spirit in a community's forgotten promise. Sometimes we must lose everything to discover what we truly possess. Sometimes we must rebuild what storms have damaged to understand what remains unbreakable. And sometimes it takes a stranger's eyes to truly see the beauty in what we've taken for granted, in the spaces between struggle and surrender, in that sacred ground where pride meets humility. This is where we find our true home. Regardless of who holds the deed,